Thanks, Heather, and thanks all for having me here today. I'm going to present on some work that's in collaboration. It's coming out of Heather's lab. Josue Chavez-Sahona and Caroline Cruz are master's students in the lab who did a lot of this carbon and biodiversity sampling. And we're working with the Southeastern Grassland Institute and Dwayne Estes on this work, as well as Bryce Hanbury from the Forest Service. So I'm going to be shifting a little bit from the landscape scale that Tori was talking about to more localized community and ecosystem dynamics, and this idea of potential trade-offs based on management objectives in carbon and biodiversity when we're managing for these open ecosystem states. So I'm going to go through this part quickly. As you all know, a lot of the eastern United States was historically dominated by oak forests that looked like this, right? So existing along a gradient from savannas on the right to woodlands on the left. And these bilayer forests contain a mature overstory of pyrophytes, an understory layer, and very little in the middle. And a lot of evidence, as we heard, shows that a primary reason that these forests look this way was frequent low-intensity disturbance, primarily surface fires, along with other regular disturbance that maintains the structure, species composition, and function of these forests. But when fire is excluded from these forests and they don't experience this regular disturbance, as has happened, the last century in a lot of our eastern oak forests, these systems change from these open woodland and savanna states to closed forest states with increased development of that sapling and mid-story layer and a lot of leaf litter on the ground, which means that we lose a lot of our biodiversity because, as we also heard, most of the biodiversity, plant biodiversity in these ecosystems is found in this understory layer rather than in the tree community. And so open forest restoration and maintenance increases this understory plant diversity, right, and associated wildlife habitat and diversity and other ecosystem services that come along with it. And so this is a major management priority in these eastern oak ecosystems. Using prescribed fire and other management strategies. But a secondary management objective, at least in a lot of places, is using forests as a tool to sequester carbon, right, to try to counteract human carbon emissions. And so we have these two management priorities, potentially managing for biodiversity, maximizing biodiversity, and also trying to increase or maximize carbon sequestration in these same ecosystems. And restoring and maintaining open forests, we know often involves thinning forests, it involves taking out trees, it involves combusting organic material when we're using fire, and those things take carbon out of the system. And so it seems like there is likely to be a conflict between these two things. You can really only potentially manage for one of them at a time. And in order to really effectively look at this potential trade-off, you need to have a pretty good idea of full ecosystem carbon, right, including below ground pools of carbon, which are often overlooked in carbon accounting. And so some of the work the lab has been doing is to talk about this overarching question of, is there a trade-off between carbon and biodiversity along open to closed forest system gradients? And to look at that, we want to know how carbon and biodiversity shift across different types of ecosystem states, and then what carbon pools are potentially contributing to differences in ecosystem carbon that we see across ecosystem states, and how are plant communities changing. And so for a few different projects in the lab, we've been sampling broadly throughout the southeastern United States, down from the coastal plains up through Kentucky. And today, I'm going to present on a subset of that data for which we currently have paired carbon and biodiversity data. We're still, processing carbon samples and identifying lots of plants from photographs. So I'm going to present on data from these 4 sites. And within each of these sites, we sampled as many ecosystem states as we could, as were available to us. You might notice that prairies are listed up there, which I know are not in eastern oak forest. I apologize, but historically it would have been found within the matrix of oak fire-dependent ecosystems. And so we're including those as well in this research. The open ecosystem states range from a few decades to almost a century of management in some places. In the closed forests, as far as we know, have been largely fire excluded. So we sampled carbon in these 15-meter fixed radius plots, kind of like modified FIA forest plots, where we measured and identified live and dead trees. We tallied and measured coarse woody debris. We harvested understory vegetation, leaf litter, and duff, and we cored down to 30 centimeters depth to look at mineral soil and fine root carbon pools. We established 10 by 10 meter biodiversity plots centered around our carbon plots, where we recorded all vascular plant species, photograph, and then estimated a cover class for each of them. And so when we talk about a trade-off between two things, this is what I mean. This is what a trade-off would look like, right? Where as one factor increases, the other decreases. So in the places where you have the highest carbon on the top left there, you also have the lowest biodiversity. So this is what our data look like. So on the y-axis, we have ecosystem carbon in metric tons per hectare. And on the y-axis, we have herbaceous species richness. And the color of those points represents ecosystem state. So purple is closed forest, and then our three other colors are various open ecosystem states: woodland, savannas, and prairies. So I think the first thing to note is that these points aren't following this hypothesized trade-off particularly clearly. This is not a regression line. This is just what that potential trade-off line looks like. And we see that there's a fair bit of divergence of our points from that hypothesized pattern. So some of the plots are where we might expect them, right? So the ones that you see circled there shows that a few of the plots that do have the highest biodiversity also seem to have lower carbon values. However, we also see that the plots with the lowest herbaceous biodiversity aren't actually the ones storing the most carbon in these ecosystems. But rather, we see that plots that are storing the most carbon also actually hold a fair amount of biodiversity in the understory. So one thing that is very clear, we can see this super clear distinction along our x-axis, right? Where if we draw that line, we see that all of our closed forest plots, like without exception, are found to the left of that, whereas all of our open forest plots across those three ecosystem states, open ecosystem plots, I guess, because we're including prairies, are found to the right. So closed forest plots hold fewer than 30 species in the understory, and open ecosystems hold more than that. However, we can't really draw that same line on the y-axis, where we find all of our closed forests have the most carbon and all of our open ecosystems have less. Instead, if we just kind of visualize this, we can put bounds around our closed forest plots. They hold about 150 to 300 metric tons of carbon, right? But we also see that quite a lot of our open ecosystem plots fall within that same range. We also find that some of them fall below and some of them fall above. But almost 75% of them or so fall either within the same range or store more carbon. So another way to look at this is categorically by ecosystem type. So here we can see our carbon data. The box plots show median and quartiles, and the black points and bars represent means and confidence intervals. So if we look at these averages categorically by ecosystem state, we can see that both our woodlands and our prairie ecosystems on average are storing comparable carbon to our closed unmanaged forests. We also see that all of our open ecosystem states are storing comparable and high levels of biodiversity, significantly higher than our closed forest plots. And so in terms of what's driving the similarity in some of our open ecosystems, we can see that for woodlands, maybe unsurprisingly, it's above ground carbon, right? So woodlands are storing just as much above ground carbon as closed forests in our data. This is driven largely by tree carbon. However, almost all of that tree carbon in woodlands is in the overstory, whereas in closed forest states, it's in a combination of overstory and midstory layers. And in our prairie ecosystems, this is driven by below ground carbon. We see really high values of below ground carbon in several of our prairie plots. Understory vegetation and fine root carbon pools are overall smaller, but we can see that our savannas are storing more understory vegetation carbon than any other site, followed by our other two open ecosystems, and savannas and prairies are storing more fine root carbon. So mineral soil shows, well, for us, it was kind of a surprising trend, just how high some of these mineral soil carbon values are in some of these open ecosystems that we sampled in our prairies, which store up to 350 metric tons of carbon in the mineral soil. And this trend was largely driven by percent carbon in the mineral soil rather than bulk density differences in soils. And we also saw that this trend held down to 30 centimeters depth. So the carbon didn't decrease as we went down in depth. In fact, there was actually a slight increase as we moved from 10 centimeters to 30 centimeter increments in our soil. So overall, what we see is that there's not exactly this clear trade-off that we might have expected. And in terms of carbon, that's driven by high carbon in a lot of our woodland plots, right? Driven by tree carbon, and by high carbon in a lot of our prairie plots, driven by mineral soil carbon. And savannas had overall lower carbon, and had the highest understory vegetation and fine root carbon pools. So if we focus on biodiversity for a minute now, we can see overall Caroline has identified in these 4 sites about 550 species total, and about 75% of those are found only in open ecosystems. So here we can see just the total number of species that we found so far in a given ecosystem state, and then how many of those were found only in that particular ecosystem state. And we find that about 25% of species in some of our open ecosystem states are only found in that place. About 430 of those species were herbaceous plants, and about 340 of them, or 80% or so, were only found in open ecosystems. And up to a little over 30% of species in our prairies and our woodlands were only found in that particular state. So if we look at how richness or biodiversity changes as a function of canopy cover, we can see that there is definitely not a linear relationship where herbaceous richness declines as canopy cover increases. But rather, we see that there's really high herbaceous richness starting at 0% canopy cover in our prairie systems, and that maintains at its level up until like 80 to 90% canopy cover, after which there's a really steep decline in richness with that subsequent increase in canopy cover. So what this tells us is that there's a very large range of canopy covers that can support high levels of biodiversity depending on how they're managed. We do, however, see that pretty linear trend if we look at how biodiversity changes as a function of mid-story density. So as mid-story density increases, biodiversity decreases. So the presence of a mid-story layer in these forests really influences understory biodiversity. And here we can see how our plant communities differ overall in their functional composition. And so we can see that closed forests are made up of about 50% woody species, where our open ecosystems are made up of about 25% woody species in terms of richness. And that what's driving increased richness in our open ecosystem states is largely forbs. This is richness and not cover. And here we can see kind of our overall plant communities by ecosystem state. So points that are closer to one another have more similar understory communities overall. And there's some overlap in our open ecosystem communities, but by and large, we can see that there's pretty distinctive plant communities in all of our ecosystem states. So overall, we see that in terms of biodiversity, closed forests have lower understory biodiversity without exception. We also see that high biodiversity exists along quite a large gradient of canopy cover, but along a much smaller gradient of mid-story density. And that different ecosystem states have pretty distinct plant communities, and a lot of plants in a given ecosystem state are only found in that particular ecosystem state. So I think the takeaways from this, we can say, again, that open ecosystems always have higher understory biodiversity than closed forests. That we saw very clearly. We also see that open ecosystems often hold just as much carbon total than our closed forests, sometimes even more, depending on the location, management history, and ecosystem state. And I think an important note, not one that I presented data on, but is that the carbon in these open ecosystem states is likely much more stable, resistant to loss and resilient following loss in these open ecosystem states than it is in closed forests. Right? It's either held below ground in mineral soil carbon, which is a long-term pool, or it's found in trees that are, quite resistant to disturbances like drought and fire. They have high wood density, and importantly, as Tori mentioned, they're found in a structure that's quite resilient and much less likely to result in overstory tree mortality in the event of a wildfire. And so I think the most important thing is that restoring and maintaining these open ecosystem states, kind of trying to counteract the homogenization towards closed forests that we've seen throughout these oak ecosystems in the past century, is really important, maintaining this heterogeneity. And that is the thing that will ensure both varied and stable carbon pools and also maximize biodiversity at the same time. Like armies and armies of people in Heather's lab, undergrads and postgrads, contributed to this work primarily through sampling carbon and processing carbon samples in the lab. So I want to acknowledge everyone that contributed to this, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts or questions.